Negative emotions. We cannot advance in our development unless we begin to observe and contend with our evil or ill-intentioned emotions. All negative emotions are useless, and each of them has its own poison. At the bottom of all these emotions lies violence and self-worship. Our emotional center, which should conduct the influences of work to us almost continually, save for brief periods that we have to endure, cannot do this if it is dominated by evil intentions. If our emotional center gives us nothing but negative states, if it continually feeds us with different combinations of these antagonistic intentions, then it stands in the way of possible growth of being, of which we might otherwise be capable. It is therefore a good thing to try to make lists of negative emotions and journal them for ourselves. In these lists, we should include various states of depression, all kinds of self-pity, any persistent resentment, of feeling badly treated, and we must also include many kinds of hatred, bigotry or bias, unpleasant forms of self-satisfaction, and the contempt of others. Particularly any feeling of meritoriousness and self-pride, vanity and narcissism, which are among the most unclean of all emotions, and shut out influence from higher centers more so than any other emotion. The purification of our emotional center is particularly emphasized in work on self, and while it is useful to make lists of negative emotions, both from what one has observed in other people and what we have observed in ourselves, the one thing that can tell us when we are negative is that faculty that the work calls inner taste. We can think of this as the beginning of real conscience. For a long time, people enjoy their negative states and savor the taste of them. It can take many years before a person begins to dislike being negative even slightly, once they begin to experience the taste, to know the sense that lingers afterward, and so to recognize them by an inner sense, which is not turned towards outer life, but towards our inner world. Some negative emotions are entirely malicious, possessing a very strong aftertaste. It is as well to begin to recognize them and tear them away from any overlying self-justifying, then see them for what they truly are. The emotional life of an individual is completely destroyed by the presence of many of these manifestations of negative emotion. How can we expect people who from early childhood have imitated and absorbed every kind of negative emotion ever to come together? The extraordinary thing is that people sometimes have marvelous pictures of themselves in this regard. They imagine that they are amiable and tolerant, easy to get along with, kind and forgiving, philanthropic, generous, and all the rest of it. What they do not see is that underneath all these things lie a great many negative emotions, a trove of inner talking, not only in themselves, but also in the person with whom they think they get along so well, which accounts for many of the strange looks on people's faces. In other words, such people think they can do, and ascribe the merit of it to themselves, to adorn and exhibit often. We must face ourselves with much more sincerity than that, and not leave our emotional life in darkness. Negative states arise mechanically, provoked directly or indirectly by some outer circumstance, by something said or not said, perhaps as a result of some fairly trivial incident. P.D. Uspensky would say two things about negative emotions: that in the face of great crises, people are not negative as a rule, and it is only the petty things of life that call forth these negative states. The other thing he said was that what irritates us most in other people is usually their mechanicalness. This, he mentioned, as one source of negative states. He said that we forget that people are machines, constantly doing and saying the same things, behaving in the same manner, and expressing the same thoughts. Above all, we do not realize that we ourselves are machines too, and that our reaction of irritation is just as mechanical as the thing in the other person that called it forth. To see another person as a machine is not enough. In fact, it is very dangerous, because then we observe only one side of the matter. We have to realize our own mechanicalness too. So what does it mean to realize one's own mechanicalness? It means long and continued effort of work on oneself, and the constant expansion of work memory, that special memory that begins to be formed in us through uncritical self-observation. One might almost say impersonal observation of oneself, by the self. Then we experience real moments of realization of our own mechanicalness, of what kind of machine we actually are. These flashes, in which one realizes their own mechanicalness directly, and not theoretically, the moments in which we see for a fact that we have behaved in that way many times before, are actually moments of self-remembering. And note here that this occurs after the fact. During the event, we only experience the taste and know internally that what we are doing does not quite sit right with the world. Something is detached from the machine and is outside the machine. It is exactly this being outside the machine for a moment that gives a feeling of self-remembering, and that indeed gives a slight taste of real I, for the self that one should remember if they could, and it is not mechanical. Perhaps we should not bring in the idea of real I here, because we are speaking in too general a sense. We should think instead of it being a moment of full observation, that we are conscious and observing I, which is looking at the machine with which we are usually completely identified. Observing I, which is formed by the work and its ideas, is the beginning of that vertical path that leads through deputy steward to steward and through steward to real I or sensei, the master. Negative emotions are, of course, mechanical. They are part of our machine as it is, and what is sometimes called our dirty machine. The task before us is to clean that dirty machine, and the dirtiest part of the machine is its negative part, which lies in emotional center, which we have acquired through imitation, and with which we were not born essentially. As P.D. Uspensky would point out, if we were born with a negative part to our emotional center, then we should have no chance of separating from it. If it were part of our inherent psychological machinery, then we could not strip ourselves away from it. Negative emotions are acquired, and therefore quite useless, whereas all that we are created with is useful to us. That is the point that we must constantly remind ourselves of. They are worse than useless because they absorb and drain away so much of our ordinary life force. All the finest transformations of the three foods, ordinary food, air, and impression, are continually being interrupted and destroyed, erroneously combined in form through the action of a negative part of our emotional center. Try to see for yourself through direct observation how a negative state drains force from you, leaving you weakened and lethargic. Try to see what happens when, having observed your condition, you genuinely try to separate from that state for your own private reasons, and not for the sake of being congratulated or to gain merit in some form. If you do this correctly, you will feel a shock and experience the sensation that you have suddenly escaped from something maleficent, something that you did not realize was evil. Then you can begin to understand why it is said that we detect the presence of negative states by means of inner taste. One can indeed see the negative state eluded, literally lying beneath us at some lower level, which is either 96 or lower still at 192, in purgatory. Negative states play a role too with all forms of illness. A person with very well-developed negative states that have never been observed, and so never contended with, will be inclined to have their general powers of resistance to illness diminished. The next point is that a negative emotion, or say the energy connected with its manifestations, may link up with an illness and so exacerbate it. In short, it could render the illness worse or more persistent than it needs to be. We might suffer from something that ought to be quite temporary, some form of illness, some form of pain. But if it happens upon a negative background that has never been faced with any courage, rendering the condition persistent or even exaggerated through unnatural growth. From another point of view, making bad chemistry in us that can only lead to misfunction, even disability. Such states are vitriolic and toxic, beginning in our psychological inner world and working their way down to the grosser parts of physical matter in our body. In this work, psychological activities or energies, called hydrogens, pass through increasing condensation into the grosser material of our body. Every psychological event, whether it be a sensation, feeling, or a thought, consumes a certain amount of energy, if it is identified with. Whereas if we are in a state of self-remembering, then energy will be created and conserved in accumulators for further use. It is useful to know what it means to look back at a state with which we were identified, then see it as something quite small and insignificant, wondering how on earth we could have consumed so much energy mechanically over the matter. All energy that is mechanically used in this manner is consumed, which is why it's so important to begin to think about what it means to live more consciously, for in this work we all seek to live more consciously, as this is the way in which we are able to conserve enough energy for growth. Both within ourselves with regard to all that is going on, as well as outwardly in our relationship to others and to life in general. Of what use is it to speak of work as focused around inner transformation, on what P.D. Ouspensky called psychotransformationism? If we do everything mechanically, if it does everything mechanically, the machine within us, then this is not living more consciously. It is just being what we are as a machine, and is simply a machine doing everything autonomously. Since negative emotions are the greatest wasters of energy and have many other destructive effects upon both our physical and mental health, it is of the greatest importance to try to prevent force from continually going into them, which will always happen if we identify with our negative states. That is why it is so important to try to separate from a negative state, and not to go with it, not to consent to it, with our mind at the very least. If both our mind and emotions acquiesce, then there is full identification and an influx of energy into negative states. That is why we should always try to starve negative states, because the more we nourish them, secretly approve of them, and subconsciously enjoy them, the more energy they will insist upon taking from us for their own survival. It's nothing personal. Someone who is slave to their negative emotions is really subservient to them. The trouble is, we naturally enjoy different forms of servitude, not recognizing that we are actually imprisoned. It is useless to speak of all this if we do not as yet know what it is to observe negative states and negative remarks in ourselves. Observe how you talk, because some individuals can only talk negatively about most things except themselves. What negative state or talk have you observed in yourself? If we find ourselves at a loss to find an answer to this question, then we are not working and doing no work on ourselves, which is the starting point of this teaching. If that is the case, then ask yourself, why am I doing no work on myself? Have you observed yourself criticizing someone else today, internally, in a negative way? You may likely say no, you have not, in which case you are not working on yourself. Why are you noticing how other people behave without noticing yourself? Because this is behaving in the most mechanical way, which is how many people behave in life. If we are in the work, then we are doing something extra to what is necessary in everyday life. We are learning something that we do not learn from life, and what is not necessary for day-to-day life. Anyone who has heard the message of this work for some time should not pass an entire day without observing at least some negative state in themselves, and without making some work effort to separate from that state, either through non-identifying with it or by what is called neutralizing it, which can be achieved by seeing the same thing in oneself as we observe in other people. Work on being. Being complacent about one's state of being is being satisfied with oneself such as we are, with our being just as it is. At our level of being, we have negative emotions, where our level of being is characterized firstly by a multiplicity of being, through many I's and a lack of unity. It is characterized by a state of sleep, by the absence of self-remembering. It is characterized by the presence of a great number of negative emotions, which are continually drowning us. A higher level of being cannot be reached if our negative emotions remain such as they are, and continue to exert the same power over us as they do every day. This is quite clear and should logically understood. Therefore, study your negative states, for this is one of the most important aspects of self-study. Observe them, note them down, and above all, remember them, so that when they return, as they always do, you may gradually recognize them before they can exert their full power over you, before you can identify with them. Particularly first thing in the morning, clear your mind of negative, unpleasant, and criticizing states before you pass into external life and open the front door. Then at night, go through your negative states, reflect upon them, and try to see things in retrospect. If you do this genuinely, if you have come to the point of recognizing your own negative condition and desire to break free from it, then you will receive help from eyes in yourself that wish to work, and they are capable of helping you to pass on to a higher state of being. Do not let the work grow cold for too long. 8 hours sleep is quite enough. But if you sleep psychologically for an entire week, then you will be in a bad way and have to start everything all over again.